whatever we think about the EU itself, we do have to accept that some form of international governance is necessary. You know, international problems exist. So I think, as most people in this room well understand, it comes down to a question of what sort of EU do we want. So I'm going to talk about the kind of EU that we've seen developing, and I guess my thesis was basically that in the area of justice and home affairs policy, security policy, and now also in the area of militarisation, we're basically seeing the construction of a European state apparatus. From the outset, I'd say the problem as far as civil liberties are concerned is that this is effectively a state being constructed by police and security elites, nameless officials that people in Ireland will recognise as, you know, securocrats. And no, this really is the case. And I'd say that the result is that the needs of law enforcement and security are consistently taking precedence when it comes to agreeing EU policy over human rights, civil liberties, procedural guarantees for suspects and defendants, and so on. The second problem is one of democracy. You know, I also believe that the EU would like to be more democratic, and it is trying to take strides to achieve this. The reality, however, of decision-making effectively delegated to the permanent representatives of the member states is that while they may decide democratically among themselves, the things that have more broadly contributed to what we know as liberal democracy are essentially missing. I'm talking here about things like parliamentary representation, where the European Parliament has long been marginalised in the area of justice and home affairs and security. This is slowly improving, but the reality is that much of the policy that we have has been drawn up without the involvement of national or European parliaments. We have big problems with freedom of information still in the European Union. It's extremely difficult often to find out what is going on, what sort of policies are on the table, and indeed what's being agreed. Another problem is that civil society organisations have been marginalised, and also there are big problems, I think, with the way EU issues and policy are reported by the media. I think it's safe to say there's literally dozens of measures going through the EU decision-making process in the area of justice and home affairs at any one time. Many of which raise crucial civil liberties issues, but which barely warrant a mention in the press. And this is, you know, it is understandable. Some of these measures are extremely complex, and it is difficult for journalists to communicate the issues at stake. Just to give you some examples, currently on the EU agenda, we have a proposal to grant Europol, the European Police Office established in 1991, what would amount to almost full investigative powers. So you're kind of creating the EU-wide police force that's long been promised. There's crucial issues on data protection, our right to privacy in the context of all the security cooperation that's going on. There's questions about the age for the mandatory fingerprinting of people within the EU. I'll come back to this later. Crucial measures on the rights of suspects and defendants. Questions about possible EU criminal records. There's a proposal on expulsion, the expulsion directive currently going through, which has many groups dealing with questions of immigration and the rights of asylum seekers. This measure will effectively make it much easier for people to be removed from the EU once it's been deemed they have no right to remain. And then there's a proposal to extend the EU terrorism law to introduce an offence of public provocation to terrorism, which obviously has big implications for questions of free speech. We already have a very broad and overbroad definition, many people think, of terrorism. This would extend it significantly further. So I think it's also fair to make the point that without the kind of broad, pluralistic, democratic debates about this policy, which I don't see happening really in any of the 27 member states, it's very difficult to expect, democratic policies or balanced policy outcomes. I think I'm right in saying that since the entry into force of the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, somewhere in the region of 1,000 measures have now been adopted in the area of justice and home affairs. And as I said before, you know, the vast majority of these have been adopted without any involvement of national or European parliaments. Obviously, these measures vary in their effect. So what I'd like to do now is give a sort of quick tour of what I call the emerging European state, but which is something that 90% of academics would disagree with. Fortress Europe is the logical place to start. The EU's system of immigration controls, border controls. Now it's my belief that human rights and civil liberties are indivisible, they're universal, they should apply to everyone. What we've seen over the last, 15 years really, is a systematic restriction of the rights of non-EU nationals, migrants and refugees. The EU has made it largely impossible for those fleeing poverty, war, persecution, environmental catastrophe, etc., to reach the EU legally. And it's also introduced a highly coercive system of surveillance, registration, mandatory fingerprinting, and essentially encouraged the employment of the whole panoply of modern policing against illegal immigrants, or so-called illegal immigrants. Now, I think regardless of where we stand on the immigration issue, and it's a very emotive issue and people have various perspectives on this, what seems to be happening to me is that these controls are now turning inwards. You know, these border controls are fast becoming wider, draconian social controls that in time will impact on the rights of everyone in Europe. And again, I'll come back to this later. In the area of policing and criminal law, there's also been vast developments. Now, there's a trend that's often ascribed to EU decision-making called lowest common denominator politics. Now, what we're seeing happening in justice and home affairs is slightly more complex, but no less crude. Consistently, we see police powers being harmonised at the highest level. Whatever the police request in terms of powers to combat terrorism, illegal immigration, organised crime, etc., these powers are effectively being harmonised at a very high level, so imposing a very high standard that affects policing across the EU. At the same time, as I said before, the rights of migrants, refugees, suspects, defendants and citizens are either being given no regard at all or harmonised at a comparatively low level.